The story does not begin with a gunshot, a speech, or a flag rising over a capital city. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, with a timetable, ink pressed onto paper, columns of numbers, arrival times calculated down to the minute, steel rails stretching across fields, forests, and borders. In the early 20th century, Europe ran on schedules. Trains carried coal to factories, grain to cities, soldiers to barracks, and credit to markets. Nothing modern moved without rails beneath it, and no nation depended on that system more completely than Germany. Germany was not reckless at the start. It was methodical, precise, obsessed with efficiency. Its leaders believed the world could be organized like a machine, and machines worked best when nothing was delayed. In Berlin, power did not sit only in palaces or parliaments. It lived inside ministries filled with maps, charts, and railway diagrams. Lines crossed the continent like veins. Every junction was measured, every route timed, every delay calculated as a risk. This was not romance or nationalism. This was logistics. And logistics had become the foundation of power. By the early 1900s, Europe was no longer a collection of kingdoms playing chess with armies. It was an economic system under tension. Trade bound rivals together. Debt tied governments to banks. Industry demanded constant inputs of raw materials. Coal had to arrive on time. Iron had to keep moving. Food imports could not pause without consequences. War, in this world, was no longer a pause from commerce. It was an extension of it. And Germany stood at the center of that system, strong, wealthy, and deeply exposed. Think about the pressure that created. Germany sat between rivals. To the west and east, powerful states waited. Overseas, global trade routes fed its factories and cities. Any disruption could ripple inward fast. A blockade could starve industry. A credit freeze could shut down production. Time was no longer abstract. Time was survival. Every hour mattered. Every day of delay carried a cost that compound interest would amplify. Inside Germany's military planning rooms, this reality shaped everything. Mobilization plans were not flexible strategies. They were rigid sequences. Trains would move at specific times, on specific tracks, carrying specific units. Supplies followed behind them. Factories shifted output in sync with rail movements. Banks extended credit based on those same schedules. Insurance firms priced risk, assuming those timetables would be honored. Once the process began, it did not allow for hesitation. It was built to move forward, not to stop. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Germany did not choose chaos in a moment of madness. It chose momentum because its system punished restraint. A delayed train did not just slow soldiers. It jammed rail hubs. It stranded equipment. It created shortages in cities hundreds of miles away. It signaled uncertainty to financial markets already nervous with debt. Confidence evaporated fast in a leveraged system. And once confidence vanished, collapse followed. Imagine the scene as tension rises. Maps cover the walls. Red and black lines mark rail corridors. Officers check watches. Clerks update schedules. Phones ring. Messages arrive faster than they can be processed. Outside, engines hiss and steam cloud the air. Trains sit ready, loaded and waiting. The question is no longer whether to move. The question is whether stopping is even possible. Because stopping means admitting the system cannot hold. And that admission carries its own kind of destruction. Germany's leaders understood something frightening. In a world organized around speed and synchronization, the greatest threat was delay. Delay exposed vulnerability. Delay invited rivals to mobilize faster. Delay allowed markets to panic. Delay meant losing control. So when crisis arrived, hesitation felt more dangerous than escalation. Movement promised clarity. Stopping promised chaos. Cities could burn later. Markets could be rebuilt later. But a broken timetable, once exposed, could destroy everything immediately. This is where the logic turns dark. Once trains began rolling, the cost of stopping rose by the hour. Troops on rails meant factories were already shifting to war output. Civilian production slowed. Workers were reassigned. Credit expanded to fund the transition. The economy began to reshape itself around the assumption of conflict. To reverse course now would not restore peace. It would create unemployment shortages and financial shock. War became the stabilizing force. Peace became the risk. Think about that. In a modern, rational state, war began to feel safer than stopping preparations for war. Destruction became a hedge against collapse. The machine had been built without brakes, only accelerators. And once pressed, those accelerators locked in place. From the outside, Germany appeared aggressive, even eager. Neighbors saw trains moving and assumed intent. But inside, the feeling was closer to entrapment. Leaders believed they were reacting, not choosing, responding, not initiating. The schedule dictated action. The rails demanded movement. Ideology followed logistics, not the other way around. The world would interpret the result as ambition. The system experienced it as necessity. This is the moment where the story demands a harder question. How did a modern society, proud of its efficiency and rationality, design a system where restraint became impossible? How did planning for security create conditions where destruction looked economical? The answer lies in the hidden power of synchronization. When every part of an economy is timed perfection, failure in one part threatens all others. Flexibility disappears. Resilience shrinks. Speed becomes fragile. Germany believed speed was strength. Faster mobilization meant faster victory. Faster victory meant lower costs. Lower costs meant economic survival. It was a clean equation on paper. But paper does not absorb shock. Real systems do. And real systems break in unpredictable ways. A timetable cannot adapt to fear. A schedule cannot negotiate. Once printed, it demands obedience. As trains began to move, that obedience hardened into fate. Borders turned from lines on maps into barriers to be crossed or defended. Neutral spaces lost meaning. Trade routes became targets. Insurance rates spiked. Credit tightened. The global economy felt the tremor before the first shot was fired, where it had already begun in spreadsheets and ledgers. The battlefield came later. This is why the story cannot be reduced to generals or speeches. The true driver sat beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight. It was a structure of modern power itself. Railways, debt, timetables, interdependence. Germany did not destroy the world out of hatred alone. It did so because its system convinced that there was no affordable alternative. And so the central question stands, sharper now than ever. When a nation builds its strength on speed, leverage, and perfect coordination, what happens a moment stopping becomes more dangerous than continuing? When delay threatens collapse, how much destruction feels acceptable? Germany answered that question with movement. The trains rolled forward, and the world followed them into fire. To understand why Germany's choice felt reasonable, almost inevitable, you have to understand how powerful it appeared before everything unraveled. This was not a fragile nation lashing out in panic. This was one of the most advanced economic machines on Earth. Its factories thundered day and night, converting coal and steel into engines, tools, and weapons. Smoke rose above industrial cities, like a permanent weather system. Inside vast halls, machines moved in rhythm, each motion measured, each output calculated. Productivity was not an ambition. It was an obsession. Germany's strength was not only industrial, it was financial. Banks extended credit deep into the economy, funding railways, ports, armaments, and heavy industry. Money moved with the same precision as trains. Capital flowed along predictable channels, reinforcing belief that the system was under control. Currency stability signaled discipline. Debt was managed, not feared. Confidence became a resource, and Germany had plenty of it. To observers abroad, this looked like dominance. To planners at home, it looked like survival through superiority. At the heart of the system sat the rail network. It was not simply infrastructure. It was strategy made steel. Tracks connected mines to mills, mills to cities, cities to borders. Every junction had a purpose. Every schedule reflected months of calculation. The rail system allowed Germany to concentrate force faster than any rival. Soldiers could be moved in days, not weeks. Supplies could follow without interruption. The army was built around this promise of speed. Logistics mattered more than bravery. Coordination mattered more than numbers. This belief reshaped military thinking. Plans were drawn not as flexible responses, but as precise sequences. Mobilization became a mechanical process. Once triggered, it unfolded step by step, train by train, hour by hour. There was comfort in that rigidity. Predictability felt like control. Leaders trusted the system because it had worked before in smaller tests. Exercises ran smoothly. Simulations looked convincing. On paper, the machine performed flawlessly. But paper hides complexity. It smooths over friction. It ignores human fear, political hesitation, and market psychology. Germany's planners treated mobilization like a contract with the future. Once signed, it had to be honored. Breaking it meant chaos. A single delay could ripple outward, blocking tracks, misrouting units, and creating bottlenecks that no one could quickly fix. Rail yards could not hold infinite trains. Cities could not absorb sudden surpluses of men and equipment. The system demanded flow. Delay carried another cost that was less visible but more dangerous. Financial confidence. Markets hate uncertainty. Credit tightens when outcomes become unclear. Insurance premiums rise when risk cannot be measured. Germany's economy depended on trust that schedules would hold and plans would execute. A stalled mobilization signaled doubt. Doubt threatened funding. Funding threatened production. Production threatened survival. The logic was circular and ruthless. From the outside, rivals saw aggression. Trains moving toward borders looked like intent. Mobilization itself became a provocation. But inside Germany, the perception was different. Leaders felt surrounded. Trade routes ran through contested waters. Food imports came from abroad. Raw materials crossed borders that could close overnight. Any enemy advantage in time could become fatal. Speed was not arrogance. It was defense. Or so it seemed. Imagine the internal debate as pressure mounted. Civilian leaders worried about diplomacy. Military planners worried about timing. Economists warned about disruption. Bankers watched foreign markets nervously. No one wanted war, but no one wanted to be late. Being second to mobilize meant facing fully supplied armies while your own units were still loading trains. It meant losing the initiative that the entire system was designed to secure. This is where the illusion of strength hardened. Germany believed it controlled movement, money, and outcomes. The railways promised mastery over space. The economy promised resilience through productivity. The army promised security through speed. Together, they formed a narrative of inevitability. If everything worked as planned, victory would come quickly. A quick victory meant limited costs. Limited costs meant the economy would survive intact. The machine would return to normal. But illusions demand maintenance. They require constant motion to remain convincing. The moment the system slowed, its weaknesses would surface. Stocks of imported goods were thinner than assumed. Credit lines were shorter than advertised. Civilian tolerance for disruption was limited. The longer the system stayed in transition, the more fragile it became. Stopping halfway exposed these vulnerabilities without delivering any benefit. Think about that position. Germany was not choosing between peace and war. It believed it was choosing between controlled escalation and uncontrolled collapse. That belief did not come from madness. It came from how the system was designed. Every incentive rewarded speed. Every penalty punished delay. Restraint carried no clear payoff. Acceleration did. This mindset infected every level of planning. Military schedules dictated industrial output. Industrial output dictated labor allocation. Labor allocation dictated food distribution. Food distribution dictated public stability. Everything connected back to the rails. The railway timetable was not a detail. It was the spine of the state. To break it was to risk paralysis. Yet, beneath the confidence, anxiety grew. Germany's leaders knew their strength was conditional. It depended on uninterrupted movement and rapid success. The longer uncertainty lingered, the more dangerous the situation became. Rivals could adapt. Markets could turn. Alliances could harden. Time favored those who could absorb delay. Germany believed it could not. The illusion of total control masked a deeper truth. The system was efficient, but brittle. It excelled at executing known sequences. It struggled with ambiguity. It could not easily reverse direction. Once factories retooled for war production, civilian goods disappeared. Once credit expanded for mobilization, pulling it back risked panic. Once trains moved, stopping them created congestion that could take weeks to resolve. From a distance, Germany looked unstoppable. From within, it felt trapped by its own excellence. The very precision that made the system powerful removed its margin for error. There was no slow mode, no pause button, only forward momentum or breakdown. This is why mobilization plans were treated with near-religious respect. They were not suggestions. They were safeguards against uncertainty. Leaders trusted the plan more than improvisation. The plan promised order in chaos. Deviating from it meant admitting the machine could not handle reality. That admission carried political, economic, and psychological costs that few were willing to face. As tension escalated, each hour without movement increased the perceived risk. Rivals watched closely. Newspapers speculated. Investors adjusted positions. Insurance firms recalculated exposure. The world responded to signals, not intentions. And the strongest signal was action. Trains moving meant resolve. Trains stopped meant weakness. Inside Germany, that signal mattered. Resolve stabilized confidence. Confidence stabilized credit. Credit stabilized production. The appearance of strength fed the system that required strength to function. It was self-reinforcing, and dangerously so. By the time decision-makers faced a moment of choice, the options were already shaped. Pause and risk economic shock, diplomatic humiliation and strategic vulnerability. Move and accept escalation with the hope of speed. Neither option was safe, but only one felt predictable. Only one followed the plan. This is how the illusion completed itself. Germany did not believe it was gambling. It believed it was executing a proven process. The trains would move. The system would hold. The outcome would justify the risk. That belief was powerful enough to silence doubts, at least for a time. But illusions are never free. They accumulate hidden costs. They defer consequences rather than eliminate them. And as Germany prepared to rely fully on its system, those costs were already gathering, unseen, waiting for the moment when speed would no longer be an advantage. Beneath the surface of Germany's apparent strength, stress fractures were already spreading. The economy looked powerful, but was balanced on assumptions that could not survive disruption. Factories depended on imported raw materials arriving on time. Cities depended on food moving across borders without interruption. Banks depended on short-term confidence to roll over long-term debt. None of these systems were designed for pause. They were designed for flow. And flow, once interrupted, could turn strength into liability with terrifying speed. Germany's leaders understood this, even if they rarely said aloud. Their economy can endure a short, decisive conflict. It cannot endure uncertainty. Every week of delay drained reserves. Every month of hesitation tightened credit. The longer the system remained suspended between peace and war, the more fragile it became. A prolonged standoff would expose shortages without delivering any strategic gain. In that sense, time itself became an enemy. The most dangerous vulnerability was trade. Germany imported critical resources it could not easily replace. Coal might be domestic, but food, metals, and industrial inputs flowed through global markets. Those markets relied on shipping lanes, insurance contracts, and financial trust. The moment conflict appeared likely, those systems reacted. Insurance premiums rose. Shipping slowed. Credit conditions tightened. Even before the first shot, the economy felt pressure. War was already leaking into balance sheets. This created a cruel paradox. The more Germany feared blockade and isolation, the more urgently it felt compelled to move first. Speed promised to outrun disruption. Delay promised to magnify it. A quick victory could secure supply lines and force negotiations before the economy cracked. A slow buildup would achieve nothing while draining resources. From this perspective, hesitation looked irrational. Acceleration looked logical. The core mechanism driving everything was mobilization itself. Once activated, it transformed the entire state. Trains began carrying troops, not goods. Factories shifted from civilian output to military production. Workers were reassigned. Credit expanded to finance the surge. These changes were not easily reversible. They were designed to be permanent until victory. Attempting to roll them back midway risked chaos. Imagine a factory that had converted to war production. Its machines are retooled, its workforce retrained, its supply contracts rewritten. If mobilization stopped suddenly, the factory could not instantly return producing civilian goods. Workers would be idle, orders would vanish, wages would stop, multiply that across thousands of facilities, and the scale of disruption becomes clear. Peace, after mobilization, would not feel peaceful. It would feel like collapse. Banks faced similar pressures. Emergency credit extended to fund mobilization assumed repayment through success. If mobilization halted without resolution, those loans would sour, confidence would evaporate, depositors would worry, markets would react. The financial system would seize up at the worst possible moment. Leaders understood this risk. They knew that once credit expansion began, it demanded continuation. The system could not easily absorb reversal. Diplomacy suffered as well. Mobilization sent signals that could not be unsent. Rivals responded in kind. Once multiple powers began moving, the space for negotiation shrank. Each side feared being the last act. Each hour delay increased vulnerability. Talk slowed. Messages hardened. Ambiguity disappeared. The machine of escalation fed itself. This is a turning point where logic eclipsed restraint. Germany realized that stopping the process would expose every weakness at once. Economic fragility, strategic vulnerability, political uncertainty. The system had been built to perform under motion, not stasis. And so, when faced with the choice to pause or proceed, proceeding felt safer. Think about that. A modern state, governed by rational calculations, concluding that continued escalation was less dangerous than stopping. Not because it wanted destruction, but because its structures punish restraint. This is how systems, not emotions, drive outcomes. As schedules locked into place, the consequences cascaded. Trains crossed borders. Neutral spaces lost their protection. Trade routes became battle lines. Markets reacted instantly. Insurance rates exploded as risk became unquantifiable. Shipping slowed or stopped. Capital fled to perceived safety. The global economy felt shockwaves that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with confidence. What had begun as a defensive calculation transformed into a self-fulfilling disaster. Germany moved to avoid isolation, and movement triggered the very isolation it feared. Rivals responded. Blockades formed. Supply chains fractured. The economy that required speed now faced constriction. The faster it moved, the more resistance it generated. Inside Germany, momentum replaced deliberation. Decisions that might have seemed reckless earlier now felt unavoidable. Each step forward justified the next. Retreat became unthinkable, not because it was morally wrong, but because it was economically lethal. Leaders were no longer choosing outcomes. They were managing momentum. The train, once a symbol of control, became something else entirely. It was no longer transport. It was commitment. Each departure narrowed the future. Each arrival closed off alternatives. The system had crossed a threshold where direction mattered less than continuation. Movement itself became the goal. This is where the illusion of mastery collapsed. Germany had believed it controlled the system. In reality, the system controlled Germany. Rail schedules dictated strategy. Credit conditions dictated diplomacy. Industrial capacity dictated political options. Human choice existed, but only within shrinking margins. The wider world felt the impact immediately. Global trade networks that had taken decades to build fractured in days. Prices spiked. Shortages appeared. Neutral economies struggled to adapt. Confidence vanished faster than ships could reroute. The modern world, so proud of its interdependence, discovered how quickly that interdependence could turn into vulnerability. Germany's leaders watched this unfold with growing alarm. The quick resolution they had hoped for did not arrive. Instead, resistance hardened. Rivals adapted. The conflict expanded beyond initial calculations. And with each passing week, the economic cost mounted. Credit strained. Resources dwindled. The very speed that was meant to secure victory now accelerated exhaustion. Yet even as costs rose, stopping remained impossible. Too much had been committed. Too many systems had shifted. Too many expectations had been set. The economy was now structured around continuation. War had become the organizing principle. To abandon it without resolution would not restore stability. It would detonate it. This is the tragedy at the heart of the mechanism. Germany was not trapped by hatred or ideology alone. It was trapped by its own design choices. By building a system that rewarded speed and punished delay, it eliminated its own ability to pause. When crisis came, escalation was not just likely. It was structurally encouraged. Think about how modern this feels. Systems built for efficiency often sacrifice resilience. They perform beautifully under expected conditions. They failed catastrophically under surprise. Germany's system was optimized for rapid execution, not uncertainty. When uncertainty arrived, the only available response was acceleration. As the conflict widened, Germany's leaders increasingly spoke the language of necessity, not desire, not ambition. Necessity. Each escalation was framed as unavoidable, each sacrifice justified by prior commitments. The logic was internally consistent, even as it led outward toward ruin. By this stage, the train had become a metaphor for fate. It could not turn easily. It could not stop quickly. Its mass and speed carried it forward regardless of obstacles. Those inside might steer slightly, but the path was largely fixed. To jump off meant destruction. To stay aboard meant risking collision. And so Germany stayed aboard. It pushed forward, hoping momentum would deliver a resolution before the system tore itself apart. That hope sustained decision-makers, even as evidence mounted against it. The alternative was too frightening to contemplate. This is the moment where history shifts from choice to consequence, where design flaws reveal themselves through suffering, where rational calculations produce irrational outcomes at scale. The economic mechanism that promised security now demanded sacrifice, and it would not stop demanding until everything else was consumed. The train kept moving, not because it was unstoppable in theory, but because stopping had been engineered out of the system. The destination no longer mattered as much as the motion, and in that motion, the world was pulled forward, whether it wanted to be or not. The collapse did not arrive in a single moment. It crept in quietly, then all at once. At first, the train still ran. Factories still produced. Offices still issued orders. On the surface, the machine functioned, but underneath, strain spread through every layer of society. Food grew scarce. Ration cards replaced abundance. Long lines formed where markets once overflowed. The rhythm of daily life slowed, then fractured. What had been an economy of motion became an economy of waiting. Germany's industrial cities, once symbols of modern confidence, began to change character. Smoke still rose from chimneys, but output no longer matched demand. Machines wore down faster than they could be repaired. Skilled workers disappeared into the war effort. Coal shortages interrupted production cycles. Power flickered. Silence filled halls that once thundered with activity. The system that required perfect flow now faced constant interruption. The financial consequences followed with ruthless logic. War consumed credit faster than it could be replenished. Emergency lending became permanent dependence. Currency stability eroded as confidence weakened. Prices rose, not because money was abundant, but because goods were scarce. Savings lost value. Wages lagged behind costs. The invisible contract between the state and its citizens began to fray. Think about the psychological weight of that shift. A society built on precision, and planning now lived with uncertainty. Schedules meant less when trains arrived empty. Timetables mattered less when there was nothing left to distribute. The same system that once promised control now delivered anxiety. Trust, once broken, did not easily return. Strikes followed shortages. Protests followed hunger. Political unity cracked under pressure. The war consumed not only resources, but legitimacy. As losses mounted, explanations sounded thinner. The promise of quick resolution faded into memory. What remained was endurance, and endurance is expensive. It drains morale as surely as it drains material. When the trains finally slowed, they did not stop gracefully. They halted amid chaos. Tracks damaged, yards overcrowded, equipment abandoned. The infrastructure that had once symbolized mastery now reflected exhaustion. Steel rails stretched across a nation that could no longer feed itself properly, let alone dominate a continent. Germany's defeat was military, but its deeper loss was structural. The economy emerged shattered. Industry lay misaligned with civilian needs. Credit systems were distorted by years of emergency finance. The currency no longer commanded trust. Rebuilding required not just factories, but faith, and faith is harder to manufacture than steel. The social consequences were severe. Scarcity radicalized attitudes. Blame replaced nuance. Simplistic explanations flourished in the vacuum left by collapse. When complex systems fail, people search for simple causes. That search reshaped politics and culture in dangerous ways. The timetable that was meant to secure the future had instead helped erase it. And the damage did not stop at Germany's borders. Global trade networks lay in ruins. Shipping routes had been disrupted for years. Markets that once assumed stability now priced in fear. Empires weakened as their economic foundations cracked. New debts replaced old ones, heavier and harder to manage. The world that emerged from the conflict was poorer, angrier, and less trusting. This is the wider lesson. Modern power does not collapse only through battlefield defeat. It collapses when the systems that sustain it lose flexibility. When economies are optimized for speed rather than resilience, they perform brilliantly until they don't. When infrastructure locks nations into irreversible paths, choice narrows at the worst possible moment. Germany's story is not unique because of its ideology alone. It is unique because it revealed the structural danger of modernity itself. Logistics can become destiny. Debt can dictate strategy. Speed can eliminate reflection. Systems designed to minimize friction often minimize options as well. Look around the modern world. Power still runs on synchronized networks. Supply chains stretch across continents. Financial markets react in seconds. Infrastructure decisions made decades earlier constrain today's leaders. Hesitation is punished. Delay is framed as weakness. Momentum is rewarded. The same pressures remain. Think about how often systems today are described as too big to stop, too interconnected to pause, too leveraged to slow down. When crises hit, leaders face familiar choices: stabilize by continuing or risk collapse by stopping. The logic that once pushed Germany forward has not disappeared. It has scaled. The story of the train is not really about steel or schedules. It is about design. About what happens when efficiency replaces adaptability as the highest value. About what happens when systems are built to perform under ideal conditions, but not survive shock. Germany did not lack intelligence or planning. It lacked brakes. In the end, the train stopped because there was nothing left to move. Resources were exhausted. Credit was broken. Society was fractured. The motion that once sustained the system had consumed it instead. The machine did not explode in a single dramatic failure. It ground itself down until it could no longer function. History often remembers wars through dates and battles. But beneath those events lie quieter forces: accounting decisions, infrastructure layouts, financial incentives. These shape outcomes long before the first shot. Germany's collapse was written into its system years earlier, hidden behind a promise of efficiency. This is why the story still matters. Not as a warning about ambition alone, but as a warning about structure. When nations build systems that cannot slow down, they risk mistaking motion for control. They risk turning necessity into justification. And they risk discovering, too late, that destruction felt cheaper only because the true costs were deferred. The world paid those costs. In broken economies, in lost trust, in decades of instability that followed. The train schedule that once symbolized modern power became a cautionary symbol instead. A reminder that progress without flexibility can become a trap. And that is the uncomfortable conclusion. Germany did not destroy the world because it wanted chaos. It did so because it believed stopping would destroy it first. That belief was shaped by rails, debt, and design choices made in pursuit of efficiency. The lesson is not about the past alone. It is about how modern systems still shape the limits of choice. If you found this story valuable, consider subscribing for more cinematic explorations of history's hidden economic forces. And if this perspective changed how you see power in modern systems, share it with someone who should see it too.